So are you ready to do some really beautiful quilting on your quilts? Well, beautiful free motion quilting takes a little bit of practice, and sometimes practice isn't that much fun. But a certain magical nanny named Mary said that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Well, what if I told you that we can do some fun practice that we enjoy, and the more we do that, the better our quilting gets. I'm Cathy, and this is Sewing Tech Talk. So we have a giveaway for today's video. It's a great pack of thread. So you're going to want all these fun colors when you start to do some thread painting, because that's what we're going to talk about today. Thread painting is a really fun way to practice because it's really hard to do it wrong, but you're practicing your free motion skills. And I find that when I'm doing thread painting, I'm going to be going over the top of some printed panels today that it's kind of a fun way to kind of get your mind away from what you're doing and kind of flow into the process of doing some free motion work. And the more you practice moving the quilt, the better you are when you're getting to the part where you want to do some specific quilting. So let me talk a little bit about setting up my panels. Now, first and foremost, you're going to want something to stitch on. I have these great panels that I picked up a couple years ago, and I just think that adding the quilting to them adds some texture. I'm going to show you some a little bit later on in the video. And I've chosen some thread to stitch on it. I have a variety of threads. I have some thin threads, which, trust me, thin thread makes you look like you're a better quilter right out of the box. We're going to see that hopefully in a little bit. Some standard weight embroidery thread for doing some additional work on the front of the quilt to add a little bit of extra oomph and color. And then you can also use a thicker thread as well. We're going to talk about doing that. So I want to set up my panel with some batting. So you can do it a couple ways. This is embroidery batting, and what it is, it's a batting and it has stabilizer built in, because we're going to be doing a lot of stitching on this. We're kind of doing freehand embroidery basically. So a batting that's going to stand up to that is great. Now, here's where it comes up to a couple different choices. You can do some work on your panel before you put the batting on, and definitely before you put the backing on. So you might want to put just the fabric and some stabilizer on the back. This is a medium cutaway. It's going to stay with the panel for the life of the quilt, so it's going to add a little bit of non-drapeability to the quilt. But keep that in mind if that's something that you want to add a whole bunch of stitching to. Now, you may or may not want to add a backing onto your quilt when you're doing some of this thread painting, because let me show you. What you can do if you do want to add the back, you can change the color of the bobbin to match the color of the top, and you can get some really cool effects on the back of the quilt. If you're doing some general all-over quilting, that's kind of fun. But sometimes when you're doing thread painting and you're kind of getting into it, the tension can kind of get a little crazy. We're going to talk more about tension in a little bit after we stitch some. But let me give you two different visuals. Sometimes I layer my panel with the batting only and maybe a little piece of stabilizer, and I don't add the backing. Here's a panel that I did, and I put the backing on, and I hope you can see when I use that dark color thread, the tension's all messed up. If I didn't have the back on and I only have the batting, well, all I have to do is let the batting later go around with some simple quilting, and you're never going to see this. So it's something that you need to consider if you're going to do a lot of stitching and you don't want to worry about the back of it. Then you can leave that backing off. Now, here's one that I did. I went ahead and put the backing on, and on this panel you can see you can't see anything, right? So I used a lightweight thread for the backing of the quilt, and you basically don't see it. I used a thin thread pretty much throughout, and so the tension stayed about the same. So just something to think about. Thinner thread gives you a little bit prettier results. If you're going to go with a thicker thread, you might want to add your batting just a little bit later. Now let's talk about those threads. So I have a whole bunch of different threads that I'm going to play with on the Baby Lock Accomplish. Why have I chosen this machine for this adventure? Well, I love the Baby Lock Accomplish. It's a straight stitch machine, and if you are a dedicated quilter, this might be the machine for you. It is a high-speed machine. Sometimes I need that speed when I'm doing some thread painting because I can really get a head of steam going up when I'm doing my little design that I'm doing. But it's a very responsive machine. So if I want to go slow also, it really slows down, and I can get that variation of speed I need depending on how fast I'm moving my hands. It is a very traditional machine when it comes to setting the tension. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. The tension dial is right up here, but I also have the pressure that I can adjust on the machine. And when I want to go to free motion stitching, it's super easy on this one. I simply put on the foot that comes with the machine, the extension table comes with the machine, and I literally have a lever over here on the right. If I go over to the left, it shows that the tension is, the feed dogs rather, are all the way down to the bottom. I have a pin feet, we'll use that in a little bit towards the end of the video, and I also have feed dogs light and feed dogs regular for either light or heavyweight fabrics. So easy machine to set up. I like it for my free motion stitching, and I've set the machine up with a very thin thread. Let me talk to you a little bit about the thin thread. So for that one quilt where you didn't see the back of it, I used a thinner thread in the bobbin. Now if I'm going to use a traditional machine that's not my Baby Lock Accomplish, it may come with a plastic bobbin. Very thin thread. If you fully wind it on a plastic bobbin, that bobbin's going to be under a lot of internal pressure, and I've actually popped some of my bobbins. So if you're using a plastic bobbin, only wind it maybe 3/4 of the way. You're still going to get a lot of mileage on your thin thread, but you don't want to put too much on there to pop your bobbin. Another reason I'm using the Accomplish, it comes with metal bobbins. Go ahead and try to pop that bobbin, right? So I can fully wind a very thin thread on the metal bobbin that comes with the Accomplish, and I'm good to go. When you're going to be using your thread, I keep mentioning super thin thread. So I have this Quilter Select, and it is a very, very thin thread. It is an 80 weight. We're going to talk a little bit later about how you can figure out how the weight of thread, the number is related to the weight of thread. Basically, the bigger the number, the thinner the thread. But I like this thread for thread painting or adding texture to the background of my thread painting because it's super, super thin. And what happens is when you're stitching on there, you just see the quilty texture part, and you don't see the thread so much. So think about that. If your skill set hasn't reached the pinnacle of where you want it to be, and every stitch, you don't want someone to see every stitch you're making, well, choose a thinner thread. You're going to make yourself that much better as a quilter visually until you get ready for it. So when you go to a thicker thread, I've used some standard embroidery threads. Then you're going to see those stitches just a little bit more. Can I use metallics? Can I use variegated? Well, sure. It's thread painting, and you're going to see in a little bit. It's really kind of fun. I matched the needle to the size of the thread. So in here I have a quilting needle it's a size 80, and it's going to work well for my standard thread or my thinner thread. And so I think it's time to get stitching, don't you? So let me move these out of the way and let's stitch some background in my little panel here. I'm going to put my gloves on, and what my gloves are is it's going to help me move the panel around. And I've already done a video on ruler work. If you want some straight lines, you can add those to thread painting as well. But in thread painting, I'm really just sketching in some thread on the top of the design. So basically, if you can see my panel here, I put in a very thin purple thread into my needle, and I'm just going to come on the background of this mountain back in here. Now I'm just going to do the direction that's basically that the fabric is showing me. The fabric is showing me the direction that I want to go. So I'm going to come up to my area. I'm going to do a needle down and needle up, pull my fabric away, and pull that bobbin thread on up. I'm going to lower the presser foot, and now I'm ready to stitch. Now I can bury that thread a little bit later, but for right now, I'm just going to let it hang out on the top of the quilt. I'm going to hold it for the first couple stitches. And basically, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in with some free form stitching. All thread painting is just adding free form stitches. Doesn't have to be a specific design, although it could be if you really want to. So let's see what that looks like. Now, hopefully you noticed that I was going really slow with my Baby Lock Accomplish, because it's a very responsive machine if I want to go slow. But I have a whole panel to do. If I want to really move out, I have the speed to do that. So I'm going to go a little bit faster, and hopefully you can see that you can do some fun sketching. And why do I say that this is a great way to practice? Well, this is a great way to practice because I'm busy just concentrating on putting my lines in. I'm not thinking about my stitch length. I'm not thinking about how fast or slow I'm moving it. I'm basically drawing with thread. And because the image is giving me, the image hasn't changed, I'm just putting some accents on the top of it. You don't have to worry so much. And besides, if I mess up the panel, it's just fabric. I'm having fun and I'm practicing at the same time. Let's go a little bit faster. Woohoo! That was a lot of fun. So I hope you can see that it's really not that hard to do some fun thread painting. It's a great way to practice. Now, if I want to change over and I want to do something a little bit closer, or if I really want to practice going around a drawn design or a drawn line, I can go around the words and that will help me practice. If I have thin thread, here's the trick. If I have thin thread and I miss just a little bit, you're not going to see it that much. It's pretty cool. So I've talked a lot about thick thread. I've talked a lot about thin thread. I want to go over to the cutting table and I want to show you some examples. And then when I come back from that cutting table, I want to show you, we're going to change over to some thicker thread, and I want to show you what that looks like. So let's head over to the cutting table where I can talk a little bit about thread weight, and don't be afraid, we're going to talk about the tension too. So now let's talk about thread weight, and I want to show you some examples of doing some thread painting, and I actually want to talk to you a little bit about doing adjusting the tension on your machine. It's scary to a lot of people, but it really shouldn't be if you understand the big concept. So now let's talk about thread weight, and I have this example. I've used some yarn. Now in thread, the higher the number, the skinnier the thread. And that's always kind of hard to remember, right? So here's the device that I use, and it's what yarn crafters use. They call it wraps per inch. And so let's take a look. So here is some thinner thread, if you will, and I have about 26 different wraps going across the inch. Here's a little bit thicker thread, and there's a little bit fewer wraps, and here's the thickest of all. There's only 13 wraps going across there. So it's actually half as many wraps as the other. So if you think about wraps as the size of the thread, the bigger the number, the skinnier the thread. Now in needles, in machine needles, not hand needles, but in machine sewing needles, the bigger the number, the bigger the needle. And for a bigger thread, we really want a bigger needle to accommodate the weight of that thread. And you're probably going to want to adjust your tension too if you're using a very thin thread or a very thick thread. And let's talk a little bit how tension is. And I mocked myself up some threads so that you can see, and I have two tension discs that mock up what the machine uses. Now most machines use two tension discs, and you probably can't even see them if they're deep inside the machine, but here are the two tension discs. Now many machines use this, some machines don't. Some machines have what's called a roller tension, and some other machines like the Baby Lock sergers, they literally measure the length of thread that goes to the stitch. But let's talk about traditional tension. So here's my 2 tension discs, and here's my normal weight thread. So if I have my 2 tension discs on either side, when I increase the pressure, which increases the number of the tension, it presses harder on that thread. Now, check it out. Here's a thinner thread. If I keep these the same size and the same pressure, when I go to a thinner thread, it's going to slide through much easier, isn't it? So I might need to increase the pressure or increase the tension on this thinner thread. Now, look at my much thicker thread. If I take this, I almost can't even fit the thread in there. I might have to loosen the tension to accommodate that thicker thread. So basically, the tension number, the greater the number, the greater the pressure. Smaller thread, you might have to increase the tension a little bit more. Bigger thread, you're probably going to have to loosen it up. And if you're concerned about where the tension was in your machine, you can always use a cell phone and take a picture of where that setting is. That's what cell phones are for, I think, is to take pictures now, and you can keep that memory of that setting. So don't be afraid of tension. It's basically just more pressure, less pressure. And that's basically all tension is. Now I want to talk a little bit while I have you up here about the different ways that when you quilt, it affects the quilt. So here is my basic panel, and this one hasn't been quilted at all yet. And see how it's nice and flat. It's a beautiful design. I don't know if it needs to be enhanced anymore, but let me show you one that I've done a little bit more stitching on. And here is its companion, and what I've done is I've done a little bit more stitching on this one, and what that has done is that added some texture. Now the more you stitch, here's the key. The more you stitch on a quilt, it draws that quilt in. So I can use that to my advantage, can't I? So here's General Sherman, the really, really big tree. Hope you can see that. And I haven't quilted really on him at all. I've quilted around him, and that made him puff out. And that gives me the cool texture effect that I really, really like. Now I've used some really thin thread on this, so the color doesn't come through as much as the texture. I have changed colors, but the thinner the thread, the less color that pops out at you. So here's the texture, and on the drawing it has it has the designs going this way, and I hope you can see. I'm going to hold it up so that you can see. I think it kind of enhances that image that's printed on the fabric. It gives it a little bit of extra dimension, and I had fun doing it, so did I improve it? You be the judge. So now, also it's going to draw in that quilt, the more quilting that you do. So here's another panel from this set that I've done, and I did a bunch more quilting. Now I want you to see, because I left part undone, I want you to see that what's happened is that the part that is undone is puffier, or less quilting, is puffier than the quilting around it. And it also kind of pulls up that, draws up that whole inside panel. So just be aware that if you do a lot more quilting, what's going to happen is this outside edge is going to like maybe puff out on you. So another thing I want you to see is on this is I've used a thicker thread on the Joshua trees, right? So I'm not finished. I'm going to add a little bit more, but you can see that that thicker thread, the color shows a whole lot more than it does on the thread in the background. So the thicker your thread, the more color that's going to show. You have to adjust your tension with a thicker thread, but also you have to keep in mind that more of that color is going to show, so you may want to match your colors on a thicker thread just a little bit more. Now this technique is also fun for free motion applique. So here's a little quilt. And what the applique is all put on with like free motion stitching. And you can see that's a little bit thicker thread. This is all just thread coming up here to do the branches. And that gives you that effect of the branches, the nice thin branches, and it's all done with thread. And it's really fun to kind of just have fun, something that doesn't have to look like anything at all as branches, and it's fun practice to do. So if you're doing your quilting and you want to do a fancy quilt design on your quilt, Practice. Practice is important. So I usually take a placemat size piece of fabric, I layer it up, and I just doodle and I have fun. Now, if you want to do it with your super thin thread, you're going to get a really neat effect on your quilting, but the thread's not going to show that much. You'll just see the effect. I actually also use like a practice quilt to get me warmed up, because you know it's an activity, free motion stitching. So here's a fun practice panel, and it's a little kids farm panel, and you can layer it. You can see if I did any quilting on here, it would really show out. So the more plain the fabric, the more your quilting is going to show. But if it's my practice panel, I can just have fun. And at the end, I have a great kids quilt. So I'm going to go back to the machine. I'm going to thread the machine on up and show you how to do some thicker threads by putting in a larger needle to accommodate that thicker thread. We're going to put the walking foot on the machine, and we're going to do some straight quilting on the outside edge to complement our little panels. So I'll meet you back over at the Baby Lock Accomplish. So I went ahead, I did some stitching, and I hope you see that little video. We put a little video insert of that in. Now I've changed to a 12-weight thread. Now you know that a 12-weight thread is going to be much thicker than my 80-weight that I was using, and then the 40-weight I used to add a little bit of color. So I did a bigger needle, so I used a top stitch needle. I'm using a 100, which is a bigger needle. I could probably use a 90, but I'm putting it in 100. And so I also put the walking foot on the Baby Lock Accomplish. Now I'm going to adjust my tension, right? Because I have a much thicker thread. So here's my tension dial. What do I have to do? Were you listening? Yes, I'm going to loosen by turning it to the left because I have a bigger thread in there. Now, I don't know if that's the right number or not. On the side of my little quilt sandwich, I put a little piece of fabric and I do a little bit of stitching, and I can see if my tension is nice. And that way I can practice on that just for a little bit. When I go to my quilt, I know my project's going to look good. So let me do a little bit of stitching with, I got to raise my feed dogs, right? So on the Baby Lock Accomplish, all I do is turn the lever over, and I'm actually going to use this next setting, which is a pin feed. On the Baby Lock Accomplish, there's a little pin that comes up and literally helps pull the quilt forward, in addition to having the walking foot which release pressure on the quilt. So I get a really nice flow to the quilting, and I know everything's going to flow through just beautifully. And now that I have my feed dogs up, I'm going to have my stitch length set. It didn't matter when I was thread painting. I'm a little bit over 2, and I can see that if I'm using the red setting, any one of the pressures is going to work. Let's see if this tension looks good. See if I guessed right. I have scissors on the Accomplish, and I'm going to look and see. Well, it's kind of hard to tell, but I can see. Trust me, it looks pretty good. Now let's get ready to rock and roll. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to just stitch around this outside edge of the quilt, and I'm literally going to use the edge of the foot as my guide. Now with the machine also comes a really, really, really nice guide. So when I'm stitching out in the middle over here, I can have this attached to the shank of the machine, and I can literally adjust this to get my parallel quilting lines when I go around the outside edge. This is my first pass, so I think I'm going to be okay just using the side of the foot. Now on the machine, I also have a needle stop that I can select. So I'm just going to touch this button when the light comes on. When I stop stitching, that needle's going to stay down, which is going to be important when I get to the corner. Did you see how at the very end I could just take that one stitch to get it exactly where I wanted to be? It's a very responsive machine. So I've taken a lot of time today. Thank you for staying with me. I hope you agree. Thread painting's kind of fun. I'm going to send it off to George. Trust me, if you're a quilter, this is a pretty nice machine. And if you want to improve your thread painting, your free motion, try thread painting. You're going to really enjoy it. I do. Thank you for watching. See you soon.
Thanks, Kathy. Once again, that was a great presentation. Don't forget, you could click on the link to download the instructions to today's presentation. Now, the Baby Lock Accomplish is not the ordinary machine. It is a powerhouse machine that is built on a platform that is industrial quality. From the all-metal commercial rotary hook to the very unique pin feed. This pin feed actually has a pin that comes up through the fabric when the needle comes up. And so what that does, it eliminates any possibility of slippage. Use this with many of the different accessories, like shown here with the commercial quality walking foot attachment going through multiple layers of naga hide, and then also for your quilting. But also I love this flexible foot for going over denim seams and then working with sheer fabric as well. Speaking of accessories, we have this wonderful guide that guides a position for your 1/4 inch or your stitch in a ditch sewing. So this machine is perfect for the quilter, it's perfect for the bag maker, for just that high performance straight sewing that you're looking for in a sewing machine. So this machine right here is at a very special price right now. Don't wait though, we have a limited supply of these. Click on the link and order your machine today. If you have any questions, call us at 1-800-865-9664. Bye for now.